Well, welcome back to the third session of our July board calls. Today we are turning our attention to the definition of listed entity and public interest entities. This is actually an effort that we are doing in close coordination with our colleagues at IAASB. And speaking of IAASB, I wanted to welcome Ken and Jeff from IAASB team with us tonight. So welcome, Ken and Jeff. It's great to have you here. I know Ken will be joining Josephine in the lead, bringing us through this topic today. Just a reminder, when we put out our strategy now a little over a year and a half ago, is that we put coordination and collaboration with IAASB as one of our top priorities. And we're hugely grateful for all IAASB has done to ensure that we stay coordinated through this period, and particularly their work as we got through the QM standards and as we're going through group audits as well. So, they are definitely holding up their end of the bargain, and Stavros and I are active collaborators, and I know we're doing the same thing. One thing to say tonight is that this is an active IAASB project. Our goal tonight is not to re-deliberate IAASB's discussions that they just recently had, but Ken is going to probably share some perspectives that have emerged from those discussions that sort of serve as an update from this paper, and some recent discussion IAASB has had with IOSCO and other stakeholders. From my standpoint, the real goal that we have as a board is about helping to achieve convergence, if possible, between the code and ICES on the issue of PIs and entities of significant public interest, and on a definition of listed, so that there's not confusions and inconsistencies between these two very complementary bodies of work. So my frame is, as I read the paper, is that we should respond in such a way, if there are flags in our mind of anything that would make alignment or convergence more challenging, if we were to continue our case-by-case scenario for differential requirements. And at the same time, just like we ask people to respect our due process, I think we have to respect IAASB's due process, that it's equally as rigorous and evidence-based as ours. And so there's a good bit of trust going on there. So to me, I really look forward to this discussion. There's a lot there. I don't have preconceived notions. I would love to hear what the board has to say on the key matters that were exposed in the discussion paper. The exposure draft that related to our issues. And I look forward to the discussion. So I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Josephine and Ken at this juncture.
Thanks, Tom. That's me first. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for that introduction, Tom. Before we start, in a rather Oscars-style approach, I have a long number of people to thank here. So first, I'd like to thank Ken again for joining us today and for helping me through this presentation, but also Jeff Kahn, Mike Ashley, and the other members of the IAASB PI Task Force, who have been very welcoming to Chumwee and I in our correspondent roles. Then, of course, we have Natalie, Kalina, and Billy, and thanking them not only for all the analysis and pulling all these papers together, but also all the background coordination with the IAASB staff, which has made mine and the PI working groups work very easy. Thank you. Finally, but certainly not least, I would like to thank the PI working group for all their hard work, and that includes Denise and Dan, who are both with us today as well, and my fellow correspondent member, Chumwee. To all of the staff and to the members of the working group, please feel free to chime in on any of the points today, that especially if I miss something. So thank you, Michelle. If we could move on to the next slide. There we go, perfect. So as usual, we'll assume that the issues paper are read, and we'll go into a lot of detail, but just provide some quick reminders of the key responses to the PI exposure draft. the preliminary views of the IAASB PI Task Force and the observations of the PI Working Group, and of course the IAASB's June board discussion, some feedback from that, which Ken will update us on. As set out in paragraph 12 of our issues paper, the key considerations for the IAASB today, and therefore what the working group are looking for feedback upon, is first of all the use of the overarching objective for both boards in establishing the differential requirements, the case-by-case approach to determining whether the requirements for listed should be expanded for PIs, including, of course, whether the application material needs to be adjusted, and the enhanced transparency about the ethical standards being applied, and of course, any other matters that the IAASB wish the working group or IAASB to consider. The definition of publicly traded entity is also a consideration for the board. We haven't forgotten it here, but we will defer this until October and we'll cover that a little bit later on. One of the other points I did want to mention is that question 4A on page 30 of the issues paper asks if the feedback from respondents has been properly reflected in the issues paper. So no need to wait until the end of the evening to pick up on that. As we go through, if there's something you feel that we've missed, then please do raise it as we go along. And then Natalie and Kalina can help you with the tricky questions. That's great. To the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. Right, so the other key objective here, of course, is to provide input to IAASB as they finalise their proposals, much that Tom has already discussed. Clearly, the two boards are working very closely together, and the timeline at the end of this presentation will show or highlight where those touch points are. And then IAASB will then explore a narrow scope amendments project as part of our normal due process. So Tom, unless there's anything else you want to add at this stage, I would actually like to hand over to Ken now for the next section of the slides.
Feel free, Ken.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Josephine and Tom, for this introduction. It is my pleasure to be here on behalf of IAASB and my colleague Jeff Kwan from the IAASB team as well here to listen to the conversation. And more than happy to brief your board as to the nature and the extent of the discussions on IAASB relative to the issues that were raised on the exposure draft. So, Michelle, if you don't mind flicking to the next slide. Okay, so the brief overview of the comments we've received, 69 comment letters. That's significantly more than our usual sort of response rate on our exposure drafts. And I guess that just signals the importance of the topic to our stakeholder community. Admittedly, some of the comments addressed the questions that you included in the explanatory memorandum, but nevertheless, 69 comment letters really signals a broad level of interest across our stakeholder community. We also had a broad spread of responses across stakeholder categories as well as jurisdictions, as you can see. I won't go into the details there, but suffice it to say that in terms of the breadth, I think we couldn't have been more satisfied. In terms of the commentaries from the regulatory community, there's 7 there. I would add that amongst the 7, we have received a response from IAASB, who is one of the monitoring group members, as you know. And IAASB itself, whilst it is an organization, it is comprised of dozens of individual securities regulators around the world. So, it is more than just the simple number there in terms of the breadth of responses and the weight of responses from the regulatory community. Why don't we just flick across to the next slide, Michelle? So maybe we'll move into maybe the first issue here, which is the overarching objective. This was set out in the 2 paragraphs in the exposure draft, paragraphs 400.8 and 9. Essentially, we would say we have received strong support for the proposed articulation of the overarching objective for additional requirements for audits of entities that we would designate or that would be designated as PIs in Part 40 of the code that deals with audits and reviews. IAASB itself was supportive of the proposal, particularly the statement of the overarching purpose in 400.9. We did receive some, I guess, some feedback in terms of the language itself. There were some suggestions to clarify the meaning of financial condition in paragraph 400.8. That speaks to the rationale for additional requirements for PIEs. There were also some concerns, I guess, with regard to paragraph 400.9 that refers to the overarching purpose being to enhance confidence in the audit of financial statements of PIEs. And really the concerns there were about whether inadvertently we were signaling that certain audits had different levels of audit quality or quality, if you will, or even auditors perhaps were being subjected to different levels of independence. So the language there triggered the sort of reactions. Michelle, next slide, please. So where we're going with the overarching objective is that we're leaning, we're going to retain the overarching objective, given the strong support, but we will retain the concept of financial condition in paragraph 400.8. We will retain it, but we will clarify it, because our perspective on the ethics board is that financial condition is broader than just financial statements. The focus is not so much on the financial statements themselves and what the audit does as part of the audit of the financial statements, but really what makes the entity an entity of significant public interest. And on IAASB, there's a strong belief that actually the concept of financial condition really captures that concept better. We had explained it in the explanatory memorandum to the exposure draft, and the thinking is that we would bring in some of that explanation that some respondents felt actually better explain what we meant by financial condition. And that's really to link that concept to the potential impact of the financial well-being on the entity, on stakeholders, because at the end of the day, that is what the public interest speaks to. It is about the financial well-being as represented through the vehicle of the financial statements. So that's really where we're going in terms of paragraph 400.8. With regard to 400.9 and the sort of concerns about differential levels of independence or audit quality, the thinking there is that we will keep the articulation, but we will tweak it, and we will tweak it to speak more to the fact that when an entity is a public interest entity, stakeholders have heightened expectations with regard to the auditor's independence. And really that's been broadly accepted. It is a statement that we've in fact embedded in our revised non-assurance services provisions that IAASB finalized in December. So it is something that's already in our standards on the ethics side. And we're just going to explain that basically those additional requirements that are in the code addressing independence are aimed at meeting those heightened expectations of stakeholders. So this really where we are, where we're heading at this point, and really IAASB was quite supportive of how the task force is proposing to move forward on that. So let me just pause here, I guess, Josephine. The next slide is kind of over to you, but I don't know how you wanted to take it, whether you wanted to pause here or carry forward, and then we pause.
I'd suggest what we could do, Ken, is we'll carry on, because I have a question that follows the next couple of slides, and then if the board have any questions, they can raise them at that point. Is that okay? Perfect. All right. So we also had a question regarding the overarching objective. That was question 15A. And it was basically, in summary, the use of that overarching objective in establishing differential requirements for both boards' purposes. So in terms of 15A, there was overall support for the overarching objective to be used by both the boards in establishing those requirements. And it was also noted that it's important for both boards to seek consistency and alignment of these important principles. As Ken has already mentioned, one of the key cautions was to make sure that the language did not infer different levels of independence and quality. A number of the respondents, though, also commented on differential requirements more broadly. Those that supported differential requirements made further comments. So, for example, that any differential requirements should focus on increased transparency. Others mentioned that differential requirements are in line with the public scrutiny over those entities and their audit. However, if they are used, they should be used sparingly, and before making a decision, it is necessary to see what they look like, which of course feeds into our due process that I mentioned earlier. A respondent also highlighted that there needs to be flexibility in the objective because there are similar but varying underlying reasons for differential requirements. Michelle, if you could move to the next slide, please. So the PI working group recognised overall that there was a lot of support for the overarching objective, and as Ken has also pointed out. But taking some of those cautionary concepts into account, including the last point I made about the rationale for setting differential requirements, in the working group's view, it would be better for the overarching objective to remain neutral and not overly focused on independence. And as Ken has already mentioned, we have liaised on this matter, and IAASB were presented a common objective to be used by both boards, and that's in paragraph 24 of Agenda 3, so that's 400.8 now. And then this gives both boards the ability to develop a more tailored objective, and for IAASB that would be along the lines of what was presented in 400.9. And the objectives would then be used as a basis for determining whether the differential requirements need to be established as part of future IAASB projects. And of course, in the more immediate term, when we undertake a case-by-case analysis of the existing requirements, which I'll cover a bit later in the presentation, and if the board is comfortable with that proposal. On this final bullet, the PI task force did not discuss the factors attached to paragraph 400.8 with IAASB, but they will be presenting their preliminary views on those to IAASB in September. But there was in fact a PI task force meeting on Friday last week. I think it was Friday, I'm pretty sure it was. And at that meeting, we agreed that in the spirit of keeping the focus on that common objective, so 400.8, the PI task force will actually propose to IAASB that the factors are also presented separately. So they would essentially come in as a separate paragraph. And this both helps maintain neutrality of the objective and does give the IAASB further time to consider those factors in our own work. If we could move to the next slide, please. So Tom, that brings me on to the first question, which is, of course, whether the board agree with the approach to the overarching objective. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Ken and Josephine, for that setup. Okay, we're going to talk about the overarching objective. Scroll into paragraph 72 right now. Anyone like to lead us off? Sashika.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody from Tokyo. First of all, thank you very much for Josephine and Ken and your team. I think the agenda is very digestible, and it also very helpful for me to understand what's the overall view about what's going on in IAASB side. So thank you very much. On question one, I agree with the possible approach to the overarching objective. And one observation I would like to make is with regard to the use of overarching objective, it is mentioned that overarching objective will be used as a basis for determining whether differential requirements need to be established as part of future IAASB project. I agree, this is one of the usage, but in doing so, I think care is necessary that we will not end up with creating many different requirements that only apply to certain entities, because I agree with the respondent's view, which is also mentioned in the slide, that IAASB should minimize the use of differential requirements that only apply to certain entities as much as possible, and that a careful and balanced approach is required when setting any further differential requirements in the ISA and ISQMs, because I think having many differential requirements that only apply to certain entities will make the standard very complex, and also it will result in not principle-based approach. But overall, I support the direction. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachika. Julie.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Josephine and Ken, for your presentation. Josephine, I will not remember all of your list of thank yous, but thank you to all that group that you listed out as well. I'm in the same place as Sachiko. I will echo her comments there at the end about creating too many differential requirements. So I'm in the same place with that, but also supportive of the way that the group has proposed the way forward. And in the paper, I think in paragraph 73, there's a comment about ensuring we still have to undertake our own due process. So I thought that was important to point that out as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Kaioi?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And Josephine and Ken, thank you very much for the presentation and all the work which you have done with your team. My comment is that it is worth exploring whether ESPAR and IAASB are able to develop a common overarching objective for the basis for differential requirements as described in little a. However, if it turns out that the boards are too far apart because the underlying reasons for the objectives, for example, independence versus audit reporting or audit effort, then the boards may need to use different terms and objectives which may be more aligned with little b. I'm not convinced that the other factors as noted in little c are that helpful for the consideration of differential requirements, because the application of these other factors leads to uncertainty in the market as to then differential requirements ought to be applied, which may not be in the public interest. Thanks. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Kai. Isabel?
Yes, thank you. Thanks to Josephine and Ken and all the others. And like Sachiko and some others, I agree with what is being proposed. However, I want to bring some introducing comments to the topic because it's a complex topic. And I wanted to illustrate why the topic of PI is complex. So you have the PI that are considered as PI by ISBA, and that's for independence purpose, and that's fair because that's within the ISBA remit. Then you have the PI that are considered PI for auditing procedures, sometimes by national standard setter, and then on top of that, you have PI requirements established by local jurisdiction in corporate law. And all these concepts are not the same. So I will take an example. In Europe, if you're a PI, as defined in the European regulation for PI, you are, as a company has to have an audit committee. And if you're not a PI, as defined by the regulation, you don't have to have an audit committee. So it's very difficult because when we speak of PI, and we are used to the regulation of a specific jurisdiction. We believe that what we know locally works internationally. And the day you start to work with various jurisdictions, you discover that when you cross a border, what is called a PI for independence purpose, audit purpose, and corporate law purpose may be different. So that's what makes the topic very complex. That's why I support, and that's for next question, but I support the case-by-case basis because we have to be very careful on that topic because not everybody has the same thing in mind when we speak of independence, auditing, or corporate law. But I support what is being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Ida.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening, everybody. I would want to echo the thanks for the IAASB's working group and the IAASB task force for the work put in. And in respect of question 1, I agree with the possible approach. There is small niggle that I have, though, that may need some further consideration, and that is that in 400.8 it seems to focus a fair bit on the financial condition. And I'm just trying to reflect on what that then would mean and what the expectation would be. And whether that then also results in a differential requirement in respect of going concern. Because if the financial condition is then suddenly raised as it is currently formulated, I think it just raises another few questions. And I know that from a IAASB's point of view, you're considering to clarify what that means, but I also think that we then need to think long and hard on what that would mean for us. So that was the sideline comment that I wanted to make in this respect. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Diane.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. Many thanks to you, Josephine and Ken, for the very well done paper, very easy to follow. Very, very important subject again, so I think it's great that we're tackling this. I'm very supportive of the approach, very similar comments as Sachiko and others, that I think it's a very reasonable approach. I think it's important to allow the IAASB and IASB standards to work together, that we have similar definitions. And I also, as we start getting into the detail, to the extent we can minimize the differential requirements, I think will be really important, because I just think from a practical operational side, it will, the more differential requirements, the more challenges there'll be and an opportunity for a misstep. But appreciate and very supportive of the comments and the recommended path forward.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, echo the thanks. So thank you very much, Josephine and Ken. Look, a great paper, huge public interest to bring the two boards together. It's been an area which has been well documented that we've struggled in the past, but we've really done a great job of doing this. I like the approach very much of getting a common objective. I think the approach you've outlined has some. I do have the same sort of niggle, just because financial condition will mean certain things, the same niggle as EDO. Whether there is something more elegant there in that regard that can take away that sort of niggle, I would do that. I think the approach probably will lend itself not to a proliferation of differential requirements. But I'm not expecting to see a proliferation, but that will be a consideration going forward. But very well done and a great paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Kumu, thank you for joining us. Imran is away today, so you're filling in for him.
Thank you,
Chairman. Good evening, everyone and board members. So my name is Kumu, and this is my first time addressing this board. It is also the first time I attend the meeting as a technical advisor to Imran. However, I do know some of you from my years in the profession and my recent attendance of the IAASB NSS meeting. Like the chairman said, Imran is on religious leave today because it is a celebration of Eid in South Africa. He sends his apologies for not being able to join the meeting today, and he has asked me to make the following comments in relation to this agenda item. Firstly, he acknowledges very clearly the work the IAASB, or the work of the IAASB, and the effort that has been put into this project. He recalls that he facilitated a session during the first joint meeting of our boards where this was discussed and urged both boards to pursue coordination. This has come a long way since then, and he's grateful for the clear feedback we received on the questions asked. Secondly, he wants to acknowledge the very high quality of the agenda paper and at the work of the working group led by Josephine and staff. The arguments were very well laid out. The evidence from the exposure draft was very well summarized, and the options put to the board were very clearly made. For this reason, Imran is generally agreeable with the comments and proposals made in the paper. In respect of the paper overall, he has noted that there's a tendency to leave some matters for the work of the auditor reporting post-implementation review. The group that is being left to this is not yet a project, but the public interest subject is already a project. So as much as Imran, Imran suggests that we should watch this carefully. This should not be a reason for us to ignore doing some work in the short term. If the post-implementation review is going to be delayed for some reason, then it would not be in the public interest that we wait until that, but we should deal with it now within this alignment project. In relation to the use of the term of financial condition, the term is already in use in several places within the IAASB standards. So the IAASB interest in retaining financial condition needs to be compared to its current usage within the IAASB standards so that consistency can be achieved. For example, we know this is already in use in ISO 260 as well as ISO 300. But to answer question one, Imran agrees with the proposal. He really appreciated the clear background provided and believes that our board has received a good steer on this topic. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Kumar. Sue.
Thank you, and thanks to all the team. Your long list of thank yous, Josephine. Echo what others says on the quality of the paper and the ease of understanding it. I probably very similar to what Sachiko and Julie said. I think it absolutely makes sense for the objectives to be aligned. It is a very important practical piece. I think, as you've suggested, it's important to look at whether there may be additional tailoring needed for IAASB purposes, but to challenge ourselves as to whether that's really necessary. I think Julie mentioned the due process point, and I'll maybe come back on that when we come to the timelines, because I think it is really important that the IAASB has the opportunity to go through its full due process and has the scope to then address what the outcome of that may be. Thanks.
Okay, Kaimor.
Thank you, Tom, and I'll echo the thanks as being put up. Similar to others, I don't remember all, so I won't go through the list, but thanks for the paper and the good quality of the paper. Similar to Julie and Sachiko, I think my comment is very similar thing. I do agree with the approach being outlined, but we need to caution to create the differences. So thank you.
Thank you. Lynn.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to Josephine, Ken and crew for this work. I'd like to talk from a public interest user's point of view And while I am okay with question 1 and doing things on a case-by-case basis, I agree with Sashiko, Julie and crew about the importance of us minimising differentiation, and I'd add to that to also reduce complexity when we look at things on a case-by-case basis. I think it's very important in the public interest and from a user's perspective that this is as clear and easy to understand as possible. And I do see a risk of complexity and too much diversity, too much differentiation coming into our standards. And particularly in light of the fact we've already got differentiation with the new LCE standard, I think that's an area to be deliberate and cautious with. Thank you.
Thank you. Len.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Apology for my internet connection today, so I haven't been able to follow all the discussion and comments. I just want to thank Josephine and Qingwei. I think it's very important for you to participate in the IAASB project, and also want to thank the support of the IAASB staff, not just in this project but from 600. I think Ken and others have been very supportive and very, very responsive to at least the 600 project. So I want to put that on my public record. I'm very supportive of the approach that's suggested by the PIE working group. I think I echo what Lynn just said. I think it's a public interest issue, actually. I think the overall public is expecting the two boards to work together. So fully supportive, have that common objectives. I do know that a number of board members raised about financial condition as being one, due process and timeline. But we just have to walk through that. I think it's important we demonstrate to the public that the two boards are working together. What you had in paragraph 72 in the issues paper is spot on. And also, I think paragraph 73 is also very important. I think you highlight that due process at both ends, and we need to respect our own individual due process to take the project forward. So I think the working group has been very spot on, and so fully supportive in terms of what you proposed. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you all. That's the last of the hands. So my summary would be strong support for the approach. However, a couple of cautions in relation to introducing more differential requirements. And I think what Lynn's point about the LCE standard should further reduce the potential for needing more differential requirements potentially. I think that's maybe one positive outcome. In reality, when we did the research, we actually don't have that many differential requirements in ISAs, and that maybe effectively we're given a warning that probably we don't need that many more, maybe even less, fewer, particularly with an LCE standard in place. I guess that's a little bit of a caution we're getting. The financial condition, there were a couple of comments, some caution around that, potential unintended consequences, the desire to have consistency with current use in it. And I think the other point is that yes, we have separate due processes, but we also want to make sure that people perceive us as ready for action when the time is come, and not slow convergence down because of our separate due processes as well. So I turn it back to you, Josephine and Ken. I hope I captured what you heard as well, but correct me because I'm certain I am usually wrong.
No, I have exactly the same notes. The only point I did want to make was to Kumo in response to Imran's question about the auditor reporting post-implementation work. It is intended, we actually have Dan on the working group, so that's very helpful, and Kalina, so very, very helpful because they're key members of that group. It is intended that this part of the project will be handed to the PI working group to deal with and go through the due process under that PI project if the board approves that project proposal in March. So there won't be a delay from that perspective. So I just wanted to put his mind at rest from that point, on that point. But otherwise, yes, you captured everything that others have mentioned, and I caught too. Thank you. I think though it's back to Ken for the next slide. Our next rendition. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. So let's move on to the summary of the, I guess the main comments we heard on question 3, which was about the approach to the definition of a public interest entity. You know, as you can see on the slides here, we've tried to boil it down to a few of the key takeaways. Essentially, would characterize the level of support as being a preponderance of support more for the broad approach than otherwise. You know, quite a few respondents had, I guess, a different take. You know, they saw perhaps a narrower approach as being perhaps a more logical or a more workable solution. But by and large, we would characterize as I say, the weight of support as being more on the side of the broad approach we had proposed in the exposure draft. You know, if you were to look across the range of respondents, you know, we had support from some within the regulatory community. Admittedly, not all respondents who came from that part of our stakeholder community. Independent national senators as well were supportive. Developing jurisdictions were generally supportive, and you know, I think that's helpful because as we know, many of those jurisdictions have not developed their own definitions of PI. Very often they have leveraged the IAASB definition. So it's very encouraging in that sense to hear that they would see the approach as being workable from the perspective. Many recommended, yes, absolutely, provide us with the support, provide us with the you know, the outreach and help us better understand and you know, point us in the right direction and so forth. And importantly, and that's something that certainly on IAASB we are very clear in our minds that we will take that up, and that's a post-implementation review, because we'd like to understand how eventually the revised approach will pan out in practice. Now, I said it wasn't universal support. Yes, we did have a significant proportion of respondents who preferred a narrow approach. And amongst those, yes, we had IAASB who asked us to consider the merit of a narrow approach. And not just IAASB, we had most of the firms, let's put it that way, as well as respondents from the EU. Essentially, they preferred a baseline definition to which then local bodies could add. Essentially, the concerns, you know, if we were to summarize them at a high level, one was about being too dependent on local bodies, having to do the work of refinement. And second one, basic concerns about potentially worsening the situation relative to inconsistent approaches to defining the universe of entities, SPIs, and potentially sowing confusion among users and stakeholders. I think at this point, I think it would be useful perhaps to share a bit of what we heard. You know, we had a conversation with IAASB last Friday. You know, they were very kind to make themselves available. We spoke with members of Committee 1, and Vili and I think Kalina, you were there on your side, so you know, do come in by all means. But I just wanted to maybe share a bit of the feedback we took away from that session with IAASB. Essentially, they acknowledged that on IAASB, we have gone through the full process in analyzing the issue and exploring the different options, etc. And they acknowledge that, yes, our thinking perhaps would have advanced further than they would have done on their side. Clearly, they are coming from a very unique vantage point, securities regulators. So they acknowledge that we perhaps would have gone a little further in our analysis and considerations of the different factors, etc. They certainly recognize IASB as being the global standard setter, and therefore our board has a broader lens than just a regulatory lens. And I think there was a measure. Well, I wouldn't say necessarily was a unanimous view that came across, but there was an acknowledgement, if I went with it that way, that if IASB were to arrive at a different place than what they had advocated in their comment letter, that would not necessarily constitute a fatal flaw, because they recognize that they really have a narrower perspective, as I said, really focused on the capital markets, and IASB really has a much wider perspective. Really considering different types of audits, different the range of entities, etc. So they did not necessarily want us to fear that if we were to arrive at a different spot, we would necessarily be offside. They were able to explain a little bit in terms of their comment, their preference for baseline definition. They gave us an example, which is really to define, for example, the category of banks. We have I think in our list categories, category B, which is entities, one of whose main functions is to take deposits. They said, well, why don't you define this as comprising banks, credit unions, and similar entities? And we were able to explain to them that we have thought about this already, and we see a range of practical difficulties by bringing in, for example, very specifically credit unions. Credit unions are not necessarily appropriate for all jurisdictions. For example, we know in California, even credit unions, that fall under a certain sort of size threshold don't even require audits. It's also difficult to envisage that if one were to come up with a definition of a bank, that definition would not include a credit union. And that's not even considering how one would define a credit union on a global basis. So, that's where they were coming from, just be a bit more precise, definition. And what they sort of suggested was, they would see it as preferable from their side to allow carve-outs from that baseline rather than go with the broader approach that we have advocated in our exposure draft, which is allow jurisdictions, local bodies to apply suitable refinements. And that allowing carve-outs in and of itself, I think, will create some difficulties for us at the global level, because we really want a global approach, not dozens of different carve-outs, etc. So that's not something that we felt on, at least on IASB, that we would be prepared to go with. Really, we would like to see the code being the global minimum baseline, in fact. We do see some difficulties with their proposed approach. Now, admittedly, the broad approach in the exposure draft does require a fair degree of reliance on local bodies in terms of the refinement, but that's I think we've gone through that process, and we've explained the thinking behind that. So maybe I'll pause here, Vidi. I just on this particular point, I don't know if you want to share anything else you took away. I think we have other things we can talk about in terms of the broad approach, but do feel free to come in at this point. Otherwise, I'll just move forward.
No, Ken, I think you've summarized it correctly in terms of the feeling around the broad approach, narrow approach. So please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so I'll be able to summarize a bit of the way forward on IASPA, but let's move on to the next slide, okay, which is Michelle, yep, publicly traded entity. So with regard to the proposed category A in the definition, in the list of sort of categories, publicly traded entities, essentially we felt there was substantial support from respondents to this category as being the replacement for the term listed entity. The genesis of this proposal basically is to move away from the definition of a listed entity in the code currently. That definition has created some difficulties in some jurisdictions, and particularly in the EU, because it uses the references the term recognized stock exchange, and that's not the term that's used in the EU. The EU goes with the formulation regulated markets, and there have been issues of interpretation and so forth. So on IASBA, we wanted to move away from this, as you know. So there was a substantial support going with that, but there were calls for us to refine or perhaps better clarify that definition, particularly whether we actually intended entities listed on main markets to be caught, and secondly, in terms of the definition of the term itself, publicly traded entity. What do we mean by financial instruments, for example, or what do we mean by traded on public markets, etc. So there were some suggestions there, perhaps to clarify what we mean in that sense. Now, IASCO itself came in and they said, well, they prefer to retain the term listed entity because that has worked very well from their vantage point. Listed entity is a term that's baked into laws and regulations across jurisdictions. So they saw it as very difficult to move away from that if we were to go with publicly traded entity. I just wanted to, yeah, I mean, that's what they said. I mean, they felt they wanted to understand basically how we would reconcile where they stand on the position on the issue of listed entity versus our proposal on publicly traded entity. And I'll be able to speak a bit to what we further discussed with them in a couple of slides. But that's basically what we heard on publicly traded entity. Maybe moving quickly to the next slide, Michelle, if you don't mind. Other pie categories. I think broadly there was support for categories B and C, B being deposit-taking institutions, C being insurance undertakings. So those were, B and C were broadly supported by, across our stakeholder categories, as you can see here. There were more concerns about categories D and E. D being, in a nutshell, pension funds. Broadly sort of characterized, and E being collective investment vehicles like mutual funds, open-ended unit trusts, etc. Essentially, the concerns there were that we would capture perhaps too many small entities and too much in terms of variety, and that would create an inordinate burden on local bodies, national standards such as DOs, etc., to do the refinement. One issue, in fact, that we heard, relative to collective investment vehicles was from France, and what we understand is that in France there are a lot of these collective investment vehicles that are very small. There's a very small number of members or investors, and they're established for tax purposes. And capturing to capture those, there's a risk of capturing those entities in France that would not be appropriate to characterize as spies. And the French profession, the institutes there, unfortunately, don't have the responsibility to set ethics standards. That's our understanding. The responsibility sits with the Ministry of Justice, and basically going with that approach would put the profession there in a bit of a bind, because they would not be able to do the refinement that would be necessary. So that's basically a part of the concerns we heard. And finally, as you can see on the slides here, there was very little appetite among stakeholders for IASB to push forward and explore perhaps defining a category that would scope in different fundraising approaches like ICOs, etc. Okay, so let me just move forward to the next slide, Michelle, to speak a little bit about basically what we tentatively thinking of moving going forward. So the thinking on IASB is, and that's been discussed at the board, is to stick with a broad approach with high-level definition, and that's basically reaffirming the previous views. And acknowledging again the challenges of baseline definition. With regard to, there were concerns, and maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, there were some concerns with the broad approach that some jurisdictions could in fact exclude whole categories. And our response is that, well, that's not our expectation. And we will clarify this through additional guidance. But more precisely, and maybe I'll link that to the next point, which is that tentative way forward is to narrow the list of categories by excluding D&E, pension funds and the collective investment vehicles. So that would basically end up with a simpler list of categories, which from our research before would cover the vast majority of jurisdictions, and certainly would be aligned with the approach in the EU. But it's so importantly, it would help us address some of those concerns about jurisdictions removing categories wholesale, because most of the concerns we heard really were relative to categories D&E. So really, you know, the way we're leaning is really to squeeze those categories or narrow them and really simplify them to make them more operable. That clearly wouldn't mean that jurisdictions wouldn't be able themselves to add on pension funds or, you know, collective investment vehicles, however so they wish to define them. But that would be, our view is that would be a more workable approach. Now, with regard to the definition of publicly traded entity and how we are planning to reconcile the concerns of IOSCO there, essentially what we heard is that if we were to explicitly state that listed entity is a category of entities that is included in the broader category of publicly traded entity, they believe, at least at first blush, that this would be workable from the perspective. You know, if you were to draw that out within the definition of publicly traded entity, because that's at the end of the day, listed entities are their bailiwick. They want to make sure that they are able to hook onto that with regard to their regulations. And their concern at the end of the day was about substituting listed entity to publicly traded entity. They did acknowledge, however, that it might be difficult for some jurisdictions to simply replace listed entity with publicly traded entity, simply because listed entity, as I mentioned earlier, is in fact the operative term that is in law regulation. So they just cautioned us that you know, that might be a challenge to make that substitution. But they did recognize that if we were to explicitly acknowledge or make clear that listed entities are included as part of publicly traded entities, that's going to help them enormously on their side. Maybe the final point they did also say is that at the jurisdictional level, in fact, some jurisdictions might simply decide to go with listed entity rather than a broader category that might include entities that are listed on secondary markets, you know, the over-the-counter, etc. So, you know, the potential for different outcomes there. So that's in terms of the category of publicly traded entity. Let me speak a little bit about the definition itself, the definition of a publicly traded entity. And there, as we heard, we had a variety of comments there on the definition. It referred to financial instruments, etc. We spoke to IASB as well. They in fact like retaining the term financial instruments in the definition of publicly traded entity, because they felt that this would have an element of forward-looking, anticipating that markets evolve and there might be different instruments that entities might use to raise capital beyond stocks, shares, etc. So they like that, and they also felt, or maybe they also express a preference, perhaps to go with the definition that's in IAS 32, simply to avoid IASB coming up with a different definition, and therefore avoiding creating unnecessary market confusion with different definitions. So that's a bit of what we sort of took away from our discussion with IOSCO. Vili, anything you want to add to what I've already mentioned?
Thank you, Ken, and I fully agree with you. I think what gave IOSCO, or that, at least that was my sense, what gave them comfort is that the IASB task force is willing to further explore alternatives so that we don't arrive at a situation where publicly traded entity replaces listed entity necessarily. And I think those alternatives are also highlighted in our issues paper in paragraph 36. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Billy. At this point, I guess, Josephine, I'll turn it over to you.
That's great. Thank you, Ken, for that really comprehensive update. Really appreciate that. Michelle, if we could move on to the next slide. I did promise that I would obviously mention what the PI working group considerations were. As you can hear from Ken, still a little bit to do on this area. And so the PI task force have to go away and take all that feedback, and particularly from IOSCO as well, and maybe think about how best to address some of those challenges. Ultimately, though, we have recognised that there was overall support for the PTE definition, but as I say, there's still some movement yet to go here, and those proposals will go to the September IASB board, and so we're going to obtain feedback from the IAASB on the definition in our October meeting, because we're just not quite ready to put a sensible view forward on this, given that we're still hearing information at this time. So, Michelle, if you wouldn't mind moving over to the next slide, please. So, Isabel already raised this point and others, so thank you, regarding the case-by-case basis. Question 15B asked participants to provide their views on the proposed case-by-case based approach, and there was, of course, overall support for the approach, but respondents also had varying views on the solution overall. For example, the monitoring group respondents, as well as some other respondents, argued that the extension to PIs should just be made for all of the current differential requirements for listed. And those reasons were set out in the issues paper, but primarily because in certain jurisdictions this has already occurred. Some suggested that none of these should be expanded to PIs at all, or only where such IAASB requirements relate to ethics, such as in ISA 260, paragraph 17. Those who supported the case-by-case based approach gave a number of reasons as to why this was an appropriate way forward. And clearly the comments made earlier about the complexities that Isabel's raised is one of them, but the one size fits all or that blanket approach will really have unintended consequences, and that the objectives attached to each ISA does need to be understood because there may be different public interest factors attached to those objectives. Respondents who disagreed with the analysis being undertaken at all gave a couple of reasons, but primarily that local bodies should actually be left to decide whether to extend those requirements. But again, we did have quite significant overall support for this approach. If we could move to the next slide, please, Michelle. So, as I say, we've noted the overall support for the flexible case-by-case approach, and that this approach recognises that one size fits all may have unintended consequences. The working group also acknowledged that certain application material paragraphs may also need to be aligned with the IASB PI proposals. including the factors such as those in A128 or A134 ISQM1, and those are in the appendices to the issues paper, and they refer to public interest or public accountability. So we may need some thoughts there. Or possibly even A41 of ISA 700 that refers to significant public interest, which of course is where the whole project started at the original point on those particular words, if those of us who are around can remember. So if we could move to the next slide. And Tom, we're on question number 2 now, but I think the board can probably do these together. A lot of words there, but does the board agree that respondents supported a case-by-case approach and that this should be the approach taken by IAASB in pursuit of a project? And also, should the project extend to the application material, considerations around that application material as well? So Tom, if I can hand back to you, we're ready for question 2 now.
So the only question I have is regarding the question itself, because our case-by-case approach includes listed entities as a potential category today. And as I remember our last discussions, we haven't precluded the possibility that we could still be case-by-case on listed entities. So I wonder whether it was intentional to narrow the field yet, or is it case-by-case approach on PI plus potentially listed and others and not making a decision yet, Josephine?
Yeah, that's correct. Sorry.
Okay. I think that is implicit in some of the remarks earlier too, was support for it, but with real caution that it should be very limited, maybe even more limited than before. But I just wanted to make that clarification that this doesn't exclude a case-by-case approach on considering whether to expand listed to PI or as well. So, okay. Any other comments? As I said, implicit was support with caution earlier. Anyone with a different point of view or want to reiterate that on A, and then also the point B in this question that hasn't really been addressed before. Okay, Sue.
Thank you. Very quick. I think there might have been 2 questions in A, but for me it's yes, yes, and yes. I agree with the proposals all the way through.
Short and sweet. Perfect. Julie.
I'm the same. Tom, thank you for the clarification. The only one I thought about a little bit more, Josephine, was little b, and wondering how broad that might become. So I don't know, when you start thinking about all the application material that would be under that umbrella, might be quite a lot. So it may, when you get to that point, maybe thinking about, tiering it in some way, where there's a specific reference, obviously tackle those ones where there's maybe a less explicit reference. Maybe that's like category 2 or something. I know I'm jumping ahead to scoping, but I just thought with all the application material we have, that could end up being quite a project. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks. And maybe I'm just struggling with the scope as well. So am I right in saying that we're considering whether requirements that currently are for listed entities only could be expanded to additional categories of entities, some or all of, well, all of which would be part of the PI definition, or is it basically a binary choice that we're going to be making listed entities versus PIs? I'm still a bit confused about that. I was hoping that basically it was going to be a case-by-case review of the public interest factors for each standards and then making a decision as to which categories of entities should be included. But I'm just a bit vague about that. And on B, I had the same concerns as Julie. I wasn't quite sure what the scope of B would be. So I've got more questions than answers, I think. Sorry.
Josephine?
Yeah, so I'll just jump in. So with A, whatever you do, it's going to be a case-by-case approach. Once IASB have decided what are their pies, then for each of our listed entity requirements that we have now, each of those individually we will look at and consider whether, in the context of the objectives of that standard, within the context of the factors and the obviously the objectives that when we think about differential requirements, we consider whether those individual requirements need to be, let's say, upgraded to pies. So that's the A piece. And then the B piece, just to be sure, in my mind, I'm thinking only where we're making specific references to like public accountability, and where we talked about, and I think I mentioned the paragraphs in particular, but I do understand the caution that we wouldn't be extending it any further than what we have in specific references. Thank you.
Billy?
Thank you, Tom. Maybe just to add to what Josephine is saying, I think it is very clear that we just have to understand what we are talking about are only the differential requirements that we currently already have dealing with listed entities. The other important thing is that I agree with Josephine the way that she explained the case-by-case approach, but what I would hope tend to do is to either decide that something applies to a listed entity or to pies. Because although I agree with this, Josephine saying that there's a scope to go to individual categories, remember that may introduce another level of confusion and uncertainty, whereas sort of just going with the requirement either applies to listed entities or pies might be a cleaner approach. But I don't want to discount that there might be other possibilities, because at the moment we simply don't know. We have to go through that exercise. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. Coyote?
Tom, thanks. Very brief views. First to little a, I agree with a case-by-case approach. And then also very brief comment to little b. I also agree with the IAASB should explore whether the application material in the IAASB standards needs to be considered for alignment to the PI definition, but the decision for which application material this should be done needs to be made on a case-by-case basis. Thanks, that's all. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you. Kuma?
Thank you, Tom. Imran is supportive of the proposed approach and has noted that the issues paper focuses on a case-by-case application retrospectively. It is not clear whether thought has been given or whether thought should be given to prospective application. In other words, will we need a framework in the future to determine these differential requirements, including the issues of which ones apply to pies, which ones don't? Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. Josephine and Willie, thanks for the clarification on the question, because I was on the same camp as Sari, a little bit confused on what was actually the outcome here. But I think now it makes sense, and I agree. I support the proposals for A and B. Thanks.
Thank you. Diane?
I'm in the same camp as Fernando all the way through. I was confused, I'm not confused, and I'm supportive.
Okay, great.
Sorry about that. I shouldn't have solidified the question.
We got there. We got there.
Apologies.
Wendy?
Okay, so first I will say thank you to Ken and Josephine. This was a very comprehensive paper, and now with those clarifications, I too fully agree. So thank you, Josephine and Billy, for clarifying that. And that's it.
Okay. So once people got the clarification, you get a lot of support for A. And on B, most support, but a little caution again about not making it too broad as well. So Josephine, your take, and you want to respond to specific comments?
I think the only one, again, to just apologise, I'll read the entire question next time. In terms of Kumo's question, the prospective application, I mean, we will obviously be looking, as I said earlier, to our objectives in thinking about developing differential requirements. But of course, we hear great caution that we would want to use those sparingly. And it doesn't, we have to go through this process as well. We may go through this case by case process and determine that actually there is no upgrading to PI for any of those requirements. That may be the view of the board, that might be the right decision at that time. So, but certainly going forward, we would think about using our objectives. And also it would probably be something, we have talked about this, it hasn't been confirmed, it's just a discussion of the PI working group, that might be something we would need to hand over to the CUSP group. I think everybody's now handing things over to the CUSP group. They're going to be very busy for them to take forward in drafting principles and guidelines. So I hope that helps with Imran's question. Thank you. Tom, I believe now it's back to Ken.
Okay, this may take a little longer. Would people want a break right now? Would be a good idea. We'll take a break. It's 5:17 my time. We'll reconvene at 5:30, if that makes sense. And then I think we'll have enough time to conclude it on time as well. So 5:30 we'll reconvene.
Josephine, we will pick up on slide 18.
Yes, please. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll start in about a minute. Could everyone reconnect, please? Okay, I think we have reasonable quorum here. Josephine, back to you.
Thank you, Tom. And over to Ken.
Thanks for passing along the ball, Josephine. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic, which is about the role of local bodies. So questions 7 and 8 in the exposure draft addressed the role of local bodies, and if you recall the structured approach we took to the definition of a public interest entity, we have the role of the code at the top level, then we have the role of local bodies coming in, and then finally the role of firms, which I'll speak to in a minute. But really just on those two questions, role of local bodies, Q7 and 8. I mean, by and large, the comments or the concerns, and more precisely, were along the lines we heard relative to the broad approach proposed in the exposure draft. If we were to summarize the two key concerns, basically, one was about the level of reliance on local bodies to do the appropriate refinements. And the second one was basically the possibility that a local body, whether it's a regulator, a national standard setter, would be able to exclude a whole category within the list of PI categories, and that was seen to be a major issue. I think the way we're pivoting in terms of a tentative way forward will help alleviate some of those concerns, in particular narrowing the list of categories to the 4 ones I mentioned earlier. So that's going to help. One of the questions was about basically how people would feel about the role of IAASB in providing implementation support, if you will, and what sort of support respondents or stakeholders would wish to see. I think by and large, I would say people would expect IAASB to step in and provide that support, whether it's through outreach or for the issuance of educational materials. There is an opportunity to collaborate with IFAC and leverage the resources and the capabilities and the network that the organization is able to provide. And certainly we will think very, very diligently about a post-implementation review further down the line once this is finalized at some point. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic, Michelle, which is the next slide, with the role of firms. This was one of the main elements of the proposals in the exposure draft. We had two proposed requirements in the exposure draft. One was in paragraph 400.16, which I speak to on this slide, and the other one was about on paragraph 417. The first one on 400.16, that was a requirement about firms evaluating entities or audit clients, and that would not otherwise already be PIs, according to local regulation or standards. and making a determination as to whether to treat those as spies. And what we heard basically was, I would say, a range of views, if not polarized views on this topic. Most of the regulatory respondents, including IAASB, were supportive of this proposal to go forward and have firms be required to determine whether to treat additional entities as spies. On the other hand, most firms on the practice side were kind of quite attentive to some of the practical challenges of moving forward with this requirement. In professional bodies as well, many concerns there amongst them. Some of the key concerns we've summarized here, and there were quite a few more. And I think what we found from this exposure draft process, basically, it's been, at least on this issue, if not on the other proposals, it's been a bit of a discovery process for us, that's something that we're acknowledging. So what we're finding here in terms of the key concerns, a lot of anxieties about the element of subjectivity in making that determination, and the possibility that there would be even more divergence and inconsistencies in practice, particularly amongst firms, in terms of what they would determine to be entities, to be pies. There was a strong view in particular, that the responsibility to determine entities as spies really ought to be with IAASB and appropriate local bodies, regulators, national centers, etc. There was also a view that if indeed entities were to be treated as spies, that should be more the role of those charged with governance of those entities rather than the firms to make that determination. And finally, many argue that firms already have to exercise judgment as to whether to apply additional independence rules based on their assessment of the nature of the entity, the risks, and so forth. So, by and large, a lot of pushback from respondents on this proposal. We had provided a list of factors in the exposure draft for firms to apply the judgment, exercise a judgment. Generally, there was support for those factors, but we received many suggestions for refinements or clarifications to those factors. So I'm not going to go into those details at this point, but suffice to say, in terms of the main requirement for firms to make determinations of entities to treat as pies, as I say, there was a lot of pushback there, at least largely from the profession side, having regard to some of the practical issues. Michelle, the next slide, if you will. The complementary requirement that went with the first requirement in the exposure draft was about disclosure. So that is the issue of public transparency. The response pattern among stakeholders pretty much followed what they said relative to the first question. The most common concerns we heard, the possibility of misconception. There are different levels of independence or audit quality. And importantly, people felt, well, if you tell us that this audit client is a PI, what do we do with that information? What does it mean? Tell us more. What are the implications for us? So essentially, people felt that there were the potential for more unintended consequences by going with these disclosure requirements, in particular tied in with the first requirement to treat entities as spies. But nevertheless, people who were asked to comment on the disclosure mechanism, even those who did not support the requirement to treat entities as spies, they were generally supportive of going for the auditor's report to make that disclosure. There were suggestions for other avenues to consider for their disclosure, transparency reports, firm websites, etc. Michelle, next slide, please. So maybe I'll summarize a bit of basically where we've landed on the task force, and we had a discussion with IAASB as well in June. The board was generally supportive of this tentative direction forward. The idea now is basically to revert the proposed requirement to treat entities as PIs to the current approach in the code, which is an encouragement for firms to make similar judgment. Essentially, the feeling is we could live without a requirement, but as long as the transparency requirement is kept. Because the transparency requirement is actually one of the main proposals in the exposure draft, and dropping that, the view on the task force, and IAASB as well is supportive of that, is that we would lose much of really the advantage of really going forward with public transparency. As I said, it is a major element of the proposals. The PIUB and the CAG as well were very supportive of going forward with public transparency. But as you can see on the slides here, once we would have public transparency, we would pivot more towards disclosing which independent standards have been applied in undertaking the audit. So it's not so much whether the entity has been treated as a PI, but which independent standards have been applied in carrying out the audit. And really the motivation behind this refocusing is that no one knows today what firms are doing already with the extent, the guidance in the extent code. With this encouragement to consider additional entities as PIs, no one has any idea what the market does with that. How firms are considering this guidance and making their determination. So that's a bit of the motivation that having the public transparency is going to stimulate a bit of market discipline for firms as to how to think about entities that would merit the application of additional independence requirements. As you might have seen in the paper as well, this is going to help us, and here as well, this is going to help us see how the revised definition is going to pan out in practice. Give it time, let it bed down before then we consider whether there is a need for further requirements for firms to go over and above what local bodies would have done with the definition. So, what the refocus does essentially then is to allow for greater specificity as to the precise independence requirements, the independent standards that have been applied by the auditor. The reason why it's important, particularly from the code's perspective, is that the code, as many of you will know, yes, it contains independence requirements, but we don't have two separate sets, if you will, because they're all in Part 4A. And yes, there are additional independence requirements for PIs, but we don't separate the PI requirements from the non-PI requirements. And the challenge for us is simply referring to the code when asserting independence doesn't really inform the stakeholder community. It doesn't really inform users. There's no clarity in that regard. And we considered what basically some other jurisdictions do. I mean, in the US, and we've discussed this in the task force, in the US, auditors that carry out their audits according to PCAOB standards do have to refer to the independent standards of the SEC and the PCAOB. In the UK, to some extent, I guess the UK policy does require firms to be a bit more specific as to which ethical requirements or ethical standards they followed in complying with independence requirements. And we believe that actually really helping putting in that level of precision will help the market better understand what auditors are basically communicating when they are setting independence. And our view as well on our task force and our board is, if you were to drop categories D and E from the broad approach, that also will help, in alleviating some of the concerns about, the potential for unintended consequences. Because as you recall, many of the concerns were about public transparency in terms of whether the entity has been treated as a PI or not. So, moving away from that and really tying the disclosure requirement more to which independent standards have been applied, we believe will help alleviate many of those concerns. So that's a bit of where we are, at least on this tentative basis, heading on IASPA. Josephine, you've been listening to some of the task force discussions as well. I mean, feel free to come in at this point, but I'll pass it back to you.
That's great, Ken. I think I'll probably pick up some of the points actually in the next slide. So if we move forward, Michelle, to slide 22, thank you very much. So and now the board is addressing question 15C in the exposure draft, which was questions around disclosure within the auditor's report that the firm has been treated as an entity. But before I talk through the feedback from respondents, it is worth reiterating some of what Ken has said. And IASB has progressed their work on the transparency requirement. And as explained, instead of using treated as PI, which was problematic for some respondents and also therefore behind some of the concerns raised in the response to this question, changes have been made to focus instead on a more factual disclosure by firms that they complied with the additional independence requirements applicable to PIs, which was also a suggestion from, I think, one or two respondents to this particular question too. So if we think about the feedback now, we have to think about it from the perspective of the treated as PI being a major issue. But that said, in terms of the feedback as to whether it would be appropriate to make disclosure, there were certainly mixed views on this. But as you can see in paragraph 84, Moore did not agree with the auditor's report being used as the mechanism for that disclosure than did. So those that were supportive didn't always state the reasons why, but the most common reasons were enhanced transparency and enhanced public confidence, and also around some of the comments that Ken said that it actually makes this knowledge known to the market where it isn't usually known. Another respondent in broad agreement questioned what publicly disclosed actually meant, particularly given some reports are not publicly available, and some who broadly agreed raised similar concerns to those that did not agree. So in particular, that a significant amount of context would need to be added to the report in order to explain what was meant as treated as PI, and that the word treated as PI may have unintended consequences, as Ken had already mentioned, since it might be incorrectly interpreted that there are different levels of independence or potentially lower levels of quality. Concerns were also raised about length and complexity of the report, and concerns were also raised in respect to confidentiality matters, in that the disclosures will risk breaching confidentiality of a planned IPO where the company has not made that known to the market. But interestingly, this example was also used by a respondent as a reason why the auditor's report was the best mechanism. We were also encouraged to explore other mechanisms for disclosures, such as the firm's transparency report or a website, or possibly even in management commentaries or the firm's annual reports. And a few respondents actually set out some of the advantages and disadvantages of those mechanisms as well, which will be obviously very useful in our thinking. If we could have the next slide, please. So the PI working group recognised that whilst close, there is still a lack of majority support for disclosure in the auditor's report. We also discussed the fact that the reference to publicly disclosed and not simply disclosed does mean exploring other possible mechanisms that were mentioned by some respondents, such as communications, for example, with those charged with governance, is actually limited. Publicly disclosing may inadvertently imply that the auditor's report is the only mechanism for disclosure as well. So we have to be conscious of that. The working group recognised that whilst the move from treated to PI was a good step forward, there may be a couple of challenges with the new wording, and we have to take that into account. So for example, if the auditor's report was considered the appropriate mechanism to disclose that the firm has complied with the additional independence requirements, a change would need to be made to ISO 700 because currently the auditor does not have to specify which independent requirements in the code were applied. And secondly, further clarity may be needed on what additional independence requirements mean in the context of any disclosure for users to properly understand it. To take Ken's point, there isn't a separate part of the code that deals with all the independence requirements with the additional PI requirements. So we have to think through that very carefully. On the plus side, however, although the code requires transparency, it does not state that such a disclosure does need to be made in the auditor's report. And the IAASB PI task force are of the view that the transparency requirement is sufficiently broad that other mechanisms could be explored by the IAASB, such as the firm's website. So clearly there is some additional thinking needed here, and the board's input therefore is really critical to the next steps and our coordination activity with IAASB. Michelle, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this brings us on to question 3, which I'm actually going to read off the slide here, so I get it right. So in view of supporting IAASB in progressing their work, does the board have any observations on IAASB's proposal to refocus the transparency requirement in the code on publicly disclosing that the auditor has complied with the additional independence requirements applicable to audits of financial statements of PIs, and that's also illustrated in the proposed revisions to paragraph 400.17, which is in paragraph 53 of agenda item 3. So Tom, if I can hand back to you, if we could just get the board's views on question 3 and any other comments they might have or questions for Ken on the previous slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine, and thank you, Ken. Isabel.
Yes, thank you. I think it's an interesting move that is being proposed, but I'm not sure it will solve the complexity of the topic. I want to look back to what I said, that you have PI consideration for independence, you have PI consideration for audit work, and you have PI consideration for corporate law. And the scope is being different. So here, if we decide that everything ends in the auditor's report, we will have to find the right balance in the auditor's report between transparency and confusion. Because we may be in the situation where you have to say, I have applied the independence requirement applicable to PI, but be careful. This entity being not a local PI, I have not applied the additional local requirement for the audit of PI, and the company itself being not a local PI has not applied the local requirement, and therefore, for example, they don't have an audit committee and they don't have complied with many other things which you would expect from a PI. So it's a situation that we deal with every day with the various definitions of PIs already, because you have local definition of PI that are different from ISBA definition of PI that firms apply globally. But we deal with that internally, and we're able to document that in our files. But the days it's outside and the day it's in an auditor's report, I think it will be very difficult for the reader to really understand what we mean by PI and why at some part of the report you say it's a PI and in a different part of the report it's a PI. But I'm not saying it's an easy fix, and I encourage looking forward. But I think if we keep something in the auditor's report, it may be very confusing for the reader. Thank you.
Kumo.
Thank you, Tom. Imran is supportive. But thank you, Josephine, for.
It's a little faint. I don't know if you're away from your microphone.
Okay. Is this better? Okay. Sorry. Thank you, Tom. Firstly, thank you, Josephine, for adding a bit more context to the publicly disclosed. That was also Imran's comment that he hopes the task force can shed further light on what is intended by publicly disclosed, and that our plans in that area are that such disclosure should be well-intentioned, easy to find, easy to understand, and consistent. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks. This is probably the area of the paper that I sort of struggled with most, and I think part of that is probably because of the mixed feedback that has already come back to the consultations. So, you know, I'm starting to think about, as we develop proposals, there is a body of evidence there that is talking about the views of a broad stakeholder group that we should be conscious of. So I think in the context of the question, if IAASB is to conclude on a requirement, then I think if we can be as conscious as possible that IAASB probably has an awful lot of things to think about. There's a lot of feedback there. Josephine, I thought the bit that you highlighted about looking at other options was really valuable. So to try and make sure that our hands aren't tied in any way would be really helpful. And if there is any way in which that requirement can be almost kind of I don't know, possibly sort of parked so that the IAASB solution can be delivered in tandem, I think that probably would be more valuable to users than having something that is then going to be expanded elsewhere. But I appreciate that might be a big wish, but that I think is probably the main concern around the difference in timing, the fact that we have this very mixed feedback, and we are likely to get that kind of thing in anything that we put out, I suspect. And then one slightly different point, Ken, you talked about the role of firms, and I was very much reminded of the discussion that the IAASB had very recently on LCEs and the role of firms there, and perhaps there's some material there that might help, because we did talk at quite some length about the role of the national bodies, the national standard setter, whoever they may be, in achieving consistency, because it's probably not in the public interest for the firms to be setting the standards, and you certainly don't want entities shopping between firms. There may be differences in jurisdictions, but they're probably less likely to be at the firm level. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Julie?
Yeah, Tom, I just wondered if I can just maybe come in very briefly on Sue's comments.
Okay, Ken.
Yeah, and Sue, I you know, I sort of understand your sort of comments and concerns, and you know, I just want to emphasize that really it's important to understand we're pivoting really away from having the make a determination as to whether to treat an entity as a PI. I mean, I know it's going to come down to perhaps semantics, you know, in terms of how we word it in the language and so forth, but really we're making an effort to really move away from all the concerns we heard on the exposure draft. And at the end of the day, it comes down to already, you know, we already have a statement, you know, that, you know, when the auditor asserts independence, the auditor has to indicate the source of the independent standards. And currently it's going to be the IAASB code or the national ethical requirements, or the, you know, whatever independent standards would have applied at the national level. And all we're doing is basically being a little bit more precise and specific about which independence standards have been followed. And that's, you know, I don't know if that helps you to some extent, but essentially that's where we're going, and moving away from, you know, all the concerns, you know, about different levels of quality, different levels of independence, etc.
So, any desire to respond to that? Just acknowledge that.
Yeah, sorry, I would if I could get my mouse on the right screen. Yeah, no, Ken, I appreciate that. It's helpful, but I think this is obviously a tricky area. So we'll just see how it develops. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, Ken. Julie?
Thanks, Tom, and I largely echo the comments that Sue just made, so I repeat them because I do think there was quite a bit of feedback that the respondents provided on this topic. So this was probably the one topic, like Sue, that I spent a lot of time thinking about. I do think that the suggested revision to focus on moving from, treated as pie to the additional requirements makes sense. I think that move is positive. But I also think, and maybe Josephine, this is going to land in the working group, our working group, but I do think how a firm makes that public disclosure is going to be tricky. And you articulated some of the real tricky points to this. So I do think that that's going to take some deep thought, because the respondents did provide significant feedback there, and we have to be, I think, responsive to that feedback. And so I think the points made in the paper in paragraph 96 are ring true with me. And so just I guess I'm just agreeing with the points you've noted in the paper and suggesting that's a little bit of work to come on that point.
Thank you, Julie. Kayuri?
Thanks. I have a brief comment to the last sentence of paragraph 95. My comment is the section on other reporting responsibilities per paragraph 43 in ISA 700 relates to situations when law or regulation require reporting in relation to the audit beyond reporting required by the ISAs. So consequently, since local law or regulation do not require such reporting, paragraph 43 is not the appropriate mechanism to address whether additional independence requirements were complied with on a voluntary basis. Rather, the appropriate place would be an other matters paragraph as set forth in ISA 706. Now to my comment to question 3. Based on the responses to the exposure draft, I'm not convinced that public disclosure within or outside of the auditor's report on whether an entity was treated as a pie is necessarily the right way forward. There are too many issues that would be difficult to resolve in seeking such transparency. It is unclear to me what the public interest issues are, if any, if an entity is not a pie, as defined by local law or the IAASB code, but a firm chooses to apply the additional independence requirements. For me, transparency is per se not a public interest issue. There need to be important reasons for transparency for it to be a public interest issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, thanks. Like Sue and Julie, I was probably struck with the parallels that we've had on the discussions with LCE from a different perspective. And again, we will be, we'll be considering that there will be a timing issue. I accepted the issue on transparency. Where the IAASB was coming from of transparency being there is a public interest concern. So it's a little bit around then what is the vehicle. We are being challenged on the vehicle on the audit report in different ways, and then the wording will be important. It's just important, I think, just to go through and explore all the possibilities as to how that transparency can be done. So there's quite a lot in those responses on the advantages and disadvantages of different vehicles. Just a careful consideration of the advantages and disadvantages of those different vehicles. Then if it comes back to the auditor's report, we can have a look and see what sort of wording we could get which would achieve this in that particular way to achieve those objectives. But I think there's a lot of feedback there that just needs to be progressed at this particular stage. Thank you.
I sort of see consistent theme emerging, that there is an opposition to exploring requirements. There's some concerns and cautions throughout, This seems vaguely familiar to another conversation, a couple conversations we had last night, a little LCA, it seems consistent theme, but no opposition to exploring it, and certainly not a bias against it, but also conscious of all the feedback we got, which would have to be part of the process. There's also some comments in terms of timing and how it interacts with our process. At one point, maybe I'll ask Billy feedback. I'm not trying to preempt anyone, but as we get towards the tail end of those who've raised hands, you know, I would want to converge on some clear guidance to the working group. And so IAASB also knows sort of our thought process in it as well. Billy, would it be an appropriate time to call on you just so we could talk a little bit about the interaction that people have been asking about?
So Tom, that's around the timing of the project.
Yes, because I think Sue raised the point about conjecture and like how these all work together, which may have an impact on how other people perceive our exploration as well.
Yes. No, thank you very much, Tom. And look, I think when the Ethics Board started their project in 2020, at the beginning of 2020, we were always aware that in the original project proposal, they were aiming December 2024 as an effective date. But I mean, that's not neither here nor there. The bottom line is we thought that from the beginning, we were planning our project in such a way that we would be able to align with the Ethics Board. And even when we put the PI working group together on our side, working with Josephine and Chanwi and the others, we've set out a project timeline, which is actually on our on the PI project page on our website, where we've indicated that you know, we believe that we can align the deliverables both from the ethics side, which is aiming to approve their project in December, and doing whatever implications that has for our standards on a timeline that can sort of coincide with that. I don't think we should get fixated on the effective date. I think Ken and I, with Josephine and all, we've had conversations as well, and there are different ways that we can deal with this. Because I think, to Sue's point, we all realize that it would be most efficient if the requirements in the code and whatever we change on our side becomes effective at the same day. I think we all accept that as a basic principle. I also just want to clarify that, and maybe that's it was something I was thinking about when Sue now raised her point, is that if it didn't come across very clearly in our in the issues paper, I just want to make it very clear that whatever we will do on our side regarding the overall objectives, regarding the case-by-case approach for the PI definition, and around transparency will be done as a package. It will be one package of narrow scope amendments to our standards. We've always intended that this will only be a narrow scope project with targeted changes that needs to be done on our side. So whatever might need to be done regarding the auditor's report will be part of that package. And I think we've also indicated in the issues paper that working with the auditor reporting implementation working group, we have decided that the PI working group will be best placed to deal with this issue, so that so that the timeline is not interrupted with whatever the recommendations of the auditor reporting implementation working group may be. So I think we are very comfortable that we can move ahead on a timeline that will be workable, and I hope that addresses some of Sue's concerns around the timeline. Sorry, the other thing that I wanted to say is, remember, in terms of our framework for activities, a narrow scope project is still a standard setting project. There will be a project proposal. We will go out an exposure draft. We'll get the responses back. What we used the ethics board's exposure draft for was as part of our information gathering and research. So all those things will happen in due course as they are supposed to.
Okay, thank you, Billy. Diane.
So I guess I would be in the camp that I really struggled with this, and I would express a little bit more than strong caution. I am not I'm struggling with what the benefit of enhanced transparency as it's described or additional public disclosure would provide to the stakeholder. Because if you're telling the stakeholder that the auditor had to comply with additional independence requirements, the question naturally is, does the stakeholder understand what that means? In my mind, in my experience, stakeholders are concerned, are you independent? Yes or no? And so I think the focal point should be, if we properly define what are listed entities, if we properly define PIEs, and that is a well understood terminology, and I'm sensitive and appreciate Isabel's comments that you've got a global definition, then you can have regulatory definitions. But if those are well defined and the auditor is saying, I am independent, I'm not sure what else additional disclosures are going to give that stakeholder. So I'm probably in the camp of a little bit more in terms of all the things that we've talked about tonight. I would hope that this one, where there is a very a strong disparity in opinions about this one, that this one would not be consume so much time that it diverts attention away from some of the other items that we talked about. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Len?
Thank you, Tom. From my perspective, on question 3, I think I'm very happy with the refocus. I think the IAASB task force have been quite responsive, and also taking consideration that Willie and Josephine and Ken, you had supplement with additional clarification. So I would encourage that our working group and the IAASB task force to continue looking at transparency. I think that's one of the issues identified in the PI project to address. But also sensitive to some of the challenges and some of the complexities and issues that other board members have raised. But I go back to what we discussed yesterday in the fraud project. I think if you look at the monitoring group public interest framework, I think one of the core consideration is be transparent in terms of how the auditor, how the standards being set, and meeting the expectation of the stakeholders. I read a few common letters. I fully understand some of the challenges involved and complexity, but I would encourage that the both board to continue to pursue a solution to address transparency. And this is something that not just one board will come up with a solution. I think that transparency might be achieved by supporting, supplementing each other's work, and that disclosure could be being a requirement or application material in both sets of standards. But it's also important to reach out to a national standard setter, also the network and firms in terms of some of the challenges they face in dealing with some of the disclosures and challenges. But so overall, I would support continue to pursue the transparency mandate based on the monitoring group public interest framework. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Len. Wendy.
Thank you, Tom. Just not to pile on too much, I struggled with getting to the refocus related to transparency without resolving some of the complexities that have been already raised, in particular by Isabel 2 times. So before there's some, I think we have to get to resolution of the complexity and some harmony before I'm comfortable skipping to either it needs to be disclosed in the report, because as an aside, I'm very sensitive to the length of the report, and we keep deferring to let's put more things in the report in other circumstances. But if we could clarify some of the other complexities, I might favor something similar to what we're doing in the US that Ken had referred to earlier, but not in a circumstance that it would be sufficiently unclear as to which level, which exact independent standards are being complied with. And again, that goes back to the definitions of the different levels that we talked about earlier. So this clearly is a very complex area, and I understand the desire to have greater transparency, but the definitions need to be clear first, and I fully don't think it should be disclosed elsewhere on a website, where the firm puts out different names of clients and different types of treatment. Thank you.
Lynn.
Thank you very much, Tom. This was the area of the paper that I found most difficult and concerned me most, because in reading the paper, I wasn't convinced that the concerns of 47% of our respondents had been taken as seriously as they should be. I found this morning's presentation has been hugely helpful in that regard, in terms of allaying some of my fears and in understanding the refocusing. And so thank you, Ken and Josephine, for that. The refocusing away from PI to a factual statement about which standard of independence I can live with, subject to some of the comments that people have already made. And I think that will be helpful, but I'm a little bit in Diane's camp. I think users want to know a binary answer on independence. You're either independent or you're not. There's nothing in between. Whilst there might be in practice, I think that's a user's view. In terms of the transparency, I naturally favour transparency. And if the changes are as Ken has described them, they're not as complex as I may have read from the paper. But the vehicle, there are multiple vehicles that could be used, and I think one of the tricks of this project will be to work through all the feedback and work out which is the most appropriate vehicle for transparency, because it may not be the audit report if the audit report is not public, because obviously being public and transparency go hand in hand. So I think this is an area of some complexity, but I feel better than now about where the two groups are getting to than I felt when I read the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to the working group for very helpful analysis of this complex issue. And I do also note with thanks the efforts that IAASB has made to refocus the discussion around the auditor's report and the independence requirements. I think that was a key progression that is going to be very helpful. I'm a bit in Lynn's camp that I would have thought that a factual statement would be helpful to users. I don't think we can assume that they just want to know that the auditor is independent. They should have an understanding of, in terms of what ethical requirements they are independent. So I'm supportive of exploring this further. When I hear Julie saying that making this kind of disclosure is going to be tricky, it sends shivers of fear down my spine, but I acknowledge that we just need to work through the concerns and the issues and hopefully reach a satisfactory conclusion. So overall, I'm supportive of moving forward to explore the topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Edo.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I'm probably coming at it a little bit differently, but I would be struggling to seek publicly disclosing anywhere else but the auditor's report. If the auditor's report is not available, there must be a reason for it, and that must be a well argued reason why it's not available, which also means that people can't get their hands on the auditor's report. So who cares? So I'm in favor of pursuing this. I'm not sure that publicly disclosing is the right word. As a result of some of the comments provided, I note that I think in Europe the requirements are already pointing to the specific independence requirements that would be applicable. In the Netherlands, we have specific independence requirements for PIs, and we refer to those as part of our independence requirements. So for me, this doesn't feel like anything new, but I'm supportive of pursuing this in the manner, or exploring this in the manner expressed. Thank you.
James.
Thank you. Thank you. I did just want to, it's a very interesting conversation, and I don't want to downplay, I think, some of the anxiety, fears about confusion by readers. I do encourage that we look back at our journey on probably the most difficult topic of transparency and user understandability and confusion, which was when we introduced the new auditor's report. And there was a lot of fear or concern that the introduction of PAN and all of the elements would create confusion and marketplace uncertainty. I think time has shown that the marketplace is broadly sophisticated in over time understanding and accepting certain assertions and statements within the audit report in a clear and concise way. We struggled in that project to decide between including the full description of everything that we need versus remaining completely silent. I think we should just work on our success on auditor report and the marketplace's adaptability to digest. My other observation is I do think that there is an appetite for additional information by the marketplace, and the transparency issue should reflect upon that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Josephine, this would be hard to interpret, but there were lots of qualifications to support. Otherwise, I think the biggest qualification sort of came from IAASB itself and how they were thinking, which allowed people to be more comfortable with sort of a more bound exploration of transparency in my mind. I have to say, I thought that the most people are willing to explore, some with different degrees of caution. Some basically wanted to understand what the requirements were first. And then there was a range of caution, but no one sort of said absolutely no, maybe one or two with a real strong caution and said, like, this, what will this contribute? I personally happen to be with Edo a little bit about the auditor's report as a logical phase, but this is something that I think would come out as part of our due process. And that's the big thing, is that whatever we put out has to be subject to comment and approval, and we'll get opinion. Lynn focused on the 47% of people cautious. There were a lot of people who supported this as well, which drives me to also thinking the need to be open-minded. And this is very similar to some of the transparency discussion we had last night, a little bit about being open-minded about what would be effective and not assume what users would find useful or not upfront as well. So that's a little bit of my comments, but I think I'm consistent with what a lot of other people are saying. I think what we're saying broadly as a board is that we're open to exploration with varying degrees of caution throughout, and that there's going to be, this is not a slam dunk thing, an easy check the box exercise, but the working group will have to put some real thought about what makes a real impact for the benefits of users and what may obscure benefits over time. That's how I read it. I don't know, Josephine and Ken, you had a different take on it.
No, that's absolutely what I heard as well, and a couple of well, more than a couple of board members also made the point that the move from treated as pie actually helped them as it moved from that statement, where a lot of the concerns, as I said, came through in question 15C was around that treated as pie language. And the move to the additional independence requirement, that more factual statement seems to have settled a lot better with some of the board members as well. And that's an important point I think we'll take back to the working group as well. Ken, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Tom has summarized it very well, Josephine, and you know, I've taken Len's advice close to heart. Let's keep the coordination going strong between the working group and the task force. I mean, you know, the IAASB has not finalized its position on this. You know, clearly we needed to talk to IAASB to get a sense. And yes, there's work to be done on your side. So, you know, let's keep the dialogue going. Let's keep the channels open for discussion.
Great, thank you.
Okay, back to you.
Yes, it's actually back to Ken again. Sorry, Ken, I think you have one more slide, I believe.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're coming to the end more or less, Josephine. So yeah, thank you, Michelle, to flicking to this last slide, at least on my part. Very briefly, we had a couple of questions more directed toward the code rather than you know, matters of coordination necessarily. We had a question out there as to whether respondents felt IAASB should open up the definition of audit client in the code. That is a bit of an idiosyncrasy related to the code, because we tie the definition of audit client to you know, whether it's listed or not, and that has consequences for the scope of entities that are caught by the independence requirements. Basically, respondents felt that IAASB should not dive in on this one at this point. You know, there's more than enough to chew on. Also on Part B, we had a question out there as to whether respondents were with IAASB that you know, we should not open Part 4B of the code, which is the part of the code that deals with assurance engagements other than audits and reviews. And people didn't think we needed to explore potentially bringing in the concept of a public interest entity in that part of the code. And then on effective date, I guess we touched a bit on that. You know, I might have mentioned that you know, at least on the task force, we're keeping a bit of an open mind. You know, we heard from quite a few respondents that people wanted a bit more space to, you know, to work through implementation and so forth. Importantly, we are very conscious that, you know, we ought to try to stay aligned as much as possible on effective date with IAASB in terms of where your project is going to go and how long that's going to take. So, you know, I think before IAASB finalizes its, you know, its decision on the effective date, I think it would be important to at least have sight of your timeline on your side, Tom and your board members, you know, just so we can have a you know, a good feel as to how you know, how much time we need to allow in terms of implementation and so forth. So, you know, that's a long way to say, you know, we're keeping an open mind on effective date. We are I guess open to perhaps pushing it back a little bit, but perhaps not too much, because, you know, we don't want this to take 10 years, you know, before we actually see the light of day, so to speak. Okay, so Josephine, I guess that takes me to my to the end of my part. So I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks again so much for all your help today and joining us and talking us through all the IAASB proposals and the decisions of the board. Michelle, if we could move on to the next slide. We only have a couple to go now. So this is the slide that Willy has already alluded to, but essentially we will be updating the IAASB PI task force ahead of their, I think it's August task force meeting on the IAASB's feedback today. And they will be preparing papers then for the September IAASB and CAG meetings. And then following that meeting, the PI working group will present to the IAASB in October 2021 further views and proposals, and we'll also be able to, of course, update the board on the public traded entity point by that point. And then following that meeting in October, our further proposals addressing the matters that I set out at the beginning of the presentation will be passed back again to to the PI task force, where they will go through approval in December. And then it's March 2022 next year where we anticipate the project proposal being developed and presented for the board. And that again, as Billy's been through all of this with you already, we'll talk about the, I'll start again. The project proposal for a narrow scope project will be presented to the board in March 2022. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks. So nearly there, just a couple of matters. I haven't heard, I did hear a couple of points, but if there are any comments that the board have in terms of whether we've captured the feedback incorrectly, then please do let us know. And also I have another question for the board, which is if there are any other matters that the PI working group should consider as we progress our work in relation to a possible project proposal. So Tom, this is the last question for the board. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any feedback on this topic? Any other matters that you want to pass to the working group? Okay, I see no hands. I think we had a very fulsome discussion, and I hope you get a sense that this board is really embracing the collaboration with IAASB on this project, and we're putting strong attention and priority to it. And I think Willy's timeline at least doesn't indicate a sense of delay whatsoever yet, Ken, nor are we asking for it. Josephine, I don't know if you have any concluding remarks you want to make on behalf of the working group.
No, just to say, of course, thank you so much to the board for all their valuable input. It's really helpful. There is a lot to think about and consider, and we will, of course, be coordinating with the IAASB PI task force along the way as well. So just thanks again. Thank you, Tom.
Okay.
Thank you as well, Tom, and thank you to all the board members. I think it's been a very good and constructive discussion, Tom. So we will take the feedback on board back to our task force, and we'll be in touch with Josephine and the working group. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Willy, anything from your side that you'd like to add?
Sorry, Tom, I was just flicking between screens, but no, I think we've summarized everything very well, and thank you for the participation. And as Josephine said, we will continue to provide our colleagues on the ethics board side with input up to the point where they approve. And then, as Josephine has clearly indicated, the full intention on our side is to go ahead with a project proposal and the narrow scope amendments.
Okay, Jim Dalkin, I want to call on you. Of course, we're going to be talking about this at the upcoming CAG meeting, I'm pretty certain. But any reactions from you from a CAG perspective?
We've had some discussions on this previously in the CAG, and I'll be curious to see what the comments will be. I think it may be across the board. I think in one sense, I think about putting additional information in the auditor's report, which it will make it longer, and we've tried to make it shorter. And I think there'll be some balancing there, but I think the CAG will be supportive of moving forward, at least with exploring this. But let's see what they say in September.
Thank you. And Michael Hippen, good to have you back with us. Any perspective from a PIOB sense? I think this is obviously, you've encouraged us strongly to collaborate, coordinate, and eliminate differences in this area.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think it was a good discussion, and as you say, the collaboration and coordination between the two boards is an important initiative, and I think in everybody's interest in trying to clarify what the requirements are that are applicable to auditors, both for the benefit of the auditors and for the users of their work. You know, the complexities are there, certainly, but I would encourage you as you go through to consider how the requirements might apply and where differentiation might be made and so forth, to keep things as simple as you possibly can, and to focus on the need for clear and concise disclosure that's going to meet the needs of users. And I would say to look carefully at all of the users of the auditor's work, and in especially a challenge when you're looking at consultations and input from consultations, to make sure that you're carefully considering all of the perspectives and not being influenced inappropriately. Perhaps if you get, let's say, lots of responses that are coming from the profession, that's certainly important points of view, but you can't, of course, do it just on counting up response letters. And so, you know, make sure that the needs of all of the users are taken into account.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's what we hope what we hope to be doing, but it's a good warning and caution for us. And I think that last discussion on transparency was an effort to try to balance that. Okay, I know everyone's sad that we're near the end of our meeting and there's none in August. So with that, I figure Billy wants to talk to us a little bit about September.
Thank you, Tom. So we've been working a little bit on the September agenda, and we've gone through the whole process of talking to all the task force chairs and everybody that is involved. So I hope to circulate, well, we hope to post the September agenda at the end of this week, or if not, very early next week. But I can give the board a little bit of a flavor for September, the September meeting. You will be very happy to hear that this meeting we will fit into 1 week only, so we won't run over into a following week. So it will be from September 13 through to September 17. The biggest part of the meeting will be devoted to ISA 600 revised. We will spend at least the first 2 sessions on going through a full draft of the standard, as Len has indicated at the June meeting as well. There will also be, we will also accommodate in that agenda a turn for the 600 standard. It will probably not be a full turn. It will only be a turn of targeted issues that will then will come back to the board later in the week. During the week, we also plan to address the conforming amendments. So those are the conforming amendments to the other standards arising from the QM projects. The exposure draft closed, I forget the date now, but the exposure draft closed in May. And we are processing the comments, so we will bring a draft of the final proposals to the board in September. We will, however, in the attempt to fit everything into the single week, we won't be able to turn any comments to come back for an approval. So the actual approval will stand over. You will remember we've got board calls in October. So the actual approval of those conforming amendments will happen at one of the October board calls. We will also, based on the discussion we had last night, we will bring the fraud project proposal to the board in September. Again, we won't have time to turn it based on the comments received during the meeting. So again, the actual approval will take place at one of the October calls. The other two topics that will be on the agenda is we will have some time to receive the recommendations from the auditor reporting post-implementation review. And then lastly, we will also be able to share with the board the feedback that we've received on our work plan consultation that is closing on August 5. So we will bring to the board the feedback that we've received on the work plan consultation, as well as hopefully a first draft of the work plan for 2022. The idea is then for 2022-2023, with the idea then that it will finally be approved at the December meeting. So Tom, that's just a little bit of a taster of what's coming up.
And we're limiting the 2-a-day sessions, which is one of my objectives. I didn't quite succeed in getting rid of all 2-a-days, but I think we only have one planned in September. So I think that's on Wednesday, right, Billy?
Yeah, and hopefully on the Wednesday, so there will be a morning session and afternoon session. But the morning session hopefully will only be an hour and a half. That's the session we will discuss the conforming amendment. So it won't be a full 3-hour session. And then the plan is also that the Friday session will only be a 2-hour session. So all in all, it only works out to a 16-hour board week. Thank you, Tom.
Okay. So any questions for Velia for our observations to me? Okay, thank you very much. These were productive three sessions that we've had in July. I think we have a huge amount that has been going on. It's been nonstop since the beginning of the year. Certainly the pandemic isn't slowing this board down. I want to thank everyone involved, board, staff, TAs, for their help in preparing for this discussion today. Minutes have been the topic of our meeting this week, and they will be distributed to the board for comment in due course regarding this meeting and posted at the September for this approval in September, together with the minutes of the June 2021 meeting. And that will also include a revision to some of the points on fraud that we discussed last night. CAG is meeting in September via video conference, September 8th through 9th. And I think Vili has just provided you an update of what's ahead in terms of timing on our September board meeting. So I'm going to just end the meeting now by saying huge thanks to all of you for all you do for this board and for serving the public interest. I hope probably more relevant to those in the Northern Hemisphere that you get a little bit of a summer break now. And for those in the South, you deserve a break as well. And I'm wishing you all good health and speak to you shortly. So thank you. And I'll speak to you at our next board meeting, but certainly probably beforehand.